Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marguerite Ragnow, the curator of the James Ford Bell Library and your host for this evening. I'm going to start with just a few housekeeping things. This is a webinar format, so you can only see and hear us, not one another. But we encourage you to use the chat function to make comments, introduce yourselves, share bibliography as we go through the course of the evening. We will take questions in the Q&A button, and we won't take the questions until the end, but you can start typing them at any times because it does take a while for you to do that. And once the lecture proper ends, Anne Good and I, and as the assistant curator of the Bell, we will be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A. But we really hope that you put your questions in the Q&A to make sure that we don't miss them. And we will read them aloud to Chad to answer when he's done with his formal presentation. We are recording this session, and we do have the live transcript, the closed captioning activated, so that if you're having trouble difficulty hearing, you can turn that on, and while it's not perfect, it is better than not being able to hear anything. So we hope that will work for you. And so thank you for your attention to these details. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our Dean of Libraries, Lisa German.
Good evening and welcome to the 59th Ford Bell Lecture. I don't think you can see me, but I'm just going to keep talking anyway. I'm Lisa German, University Librarian and Dean of Libraries for the University of Minnesota. The University Libraries includes a dozen sites that attract more than 1.6 million visitors annually to access our books, electronic holdings, archives, and special collections. Among those special ones is our James Ford Bell Library, a wonderful collection of documents, rare books, artifacts, and maps representing trade and cultural interaction in the early modern era, up to about 1800. Founded by the longtime university regent and outstanding business person, James Ford Bell, the Bell Library has continued to grow and evolve in its holdings and in the scholarship it inspires. The James Ford Bell Lecture is an opportunity to hear from a scholar whose work connects to and illuminates part of the Bell's library collection. The Bell's library theme this year is Hidden in Plain Sight, as we strive to make Indigenous peoples more visible in the collection. This evening, we'll hear from history professor Chad Anderson, who is the author of The Storied Landscape of the Iroquoia. He comes to us virtually from Hartwick College in New York State. He'll be speaking on stories of Indigenous power in early American cartography. Before we begin, I'd like to share a perspective that's relevant and important to all of us. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Maggie Ragnow, curator of the James Ford Bell Library, who will begin our program.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome again, everyone. We're very pleased to bring you this virtual event. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their generous support this evening. The University of Minnesota Friends of the Libraries, the Center for Pre-Modern Studies, and especially the Associates of the James Ford Bell Library, who have been generous supporters of the Bell Library since 1963. Thank you all. As Lisa mentioned, our speaker this evening is Chad Anderson, who is a visiting assistant professor of history at Hartwick College in Oneonta, New York, which I learned is one of the northernmost cities of the Appalachian region. He earned his PhD from the University of California, Davis, which awarded him a dissertation fellowship in 2011-2012. And at Hartwick, he teaches a variety of courses about early America, including the American West in Film and Reality, which I suspect is one of the more popular classes. He won the John Murrin Prize, awarded by the McNeil Center for American Studies in 2017, for his article, Rediscovering Native North America, Settlements, Maps, and Empires in the Eastern Woodlands, published in the interdisciplinary journal Early American Studies. He also has contributed a chapter to Investing in the Early Modern Built Environment, Europeans, Asians, Settlers, and Indigenous Societies, edited by Carol Shamus and published by Brill in 2012. This evening, he will speak to us about the most famous British maps of the period to explore a more complex story of how Native Americans shaped the geography of an imagined British Empire and the future of North America. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Chad Anderson.
Thank you very much. I'm coming to you from New York, which is the homelands of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Six Nations, who I think you will hopefully get a sense were and are very important parts of American history and culture. And I also want to thank the James Ford Bell Library and everybody who worked very hard to put this event on. I was hoping to, be there, but I'm very grateful to be able to do this over Zoom. And thank you all for coming. I greatly appreciate it. So, historians. Historians are really bad salespeople. Now, I don't imagine that you expected that was the line that I would open with, but I did. I imagine, let me be more specific, I imagine if we were better at selling things, maybe we'd do something more lucrative than writing history. But what I mean is that historians only know a couple of tricks on how to sell you on their ideas. And once you see them, it's hard not to see them all the time. Now, I won't name names, as I'd like to still have something of a career. But in general, I think it's safe to say that historians really like a good straw man argument. Open up the introduction to any book, and there's a good chance that there's going to be a riff about what we, in quotes, think about a topic by referencing probably a ridiculously out of date, but perhaps influential in its time book from decades ago that allegedly speaks to our understanding of the past. So if you get nothing else out of tonight, I've ruined books for you. You'll never be able to read a history book again because they're all the same. And already I'm probably also in trouble for telling you our trade secrets, right up there with some scientific patent, highly protected scientific patent, how historians write introductions, but there's more. Variation on this approach is the idea, a claim usually that one person only, that person is of course the author, has truly captured the innovative techniques and approach needed to write about a topic. So having told you all of these secrets, I really want to say something exactly like that, along those lines, because it's how historians talk. We can't help it, but it also makes me seem so much more important if I'm the only one to ever figure out anything and we know something. But history doesn't quite work like that. If you read enough history, history, you kind of figure out, is primarily about applying, perhaps stealing ideas, techniques from another discipline or a different field of history, and then applying it to a topic to get a fresh perspective, to say something quote unquote new. Of course, there's nothing really truly new in history. They don't tell anybody that either. But borrowing, using ideas. I mean, history is probably the best discipline at doing this, and it's been doing it for decades, taking different aspects of the social sciences and applying them to the study of the past. And so historians of cartography, people who like maps, don't always have the same interests as early American historians in general. And what I'm hoping to do tonight is have a conversation, put these kind of two different fields in conversation by looking at some famous colonial maps. And I do believe I have something fresh enough to say about maps and empires. But what I really want to do is take you along on a journey to unravel some threads of an idea to look for its origin. And the idea, this concept, this claim that I want to look at is simple enough that on paper, at least, by the 1750s, the British think that they've successfully created, at least they claim on paper, to have created a North American empire that stretched far beyond the coast, at least to the Ohio, perhaps to the Mississippi, maybe, as you can maybe get a sense of from the map that you're waiting for me to say something about, all the way across the continent. So perhaps along the way, I hope to, we can see some approaches to locate Native American power and see Native American influence and ideas and maps largely created by and for European empires. That is, what can we see beyond the obvious intent of the map maker? So the title is Hidden in Plain Sight, and it reflects the fact that most of the clues needed to tell the story will be on the screen in front of you. Sometimes I will even zoom in so you can read them and not just stare at a distant map. But those of you who study 18th century maps kind of know that there's an awful lot of writing on them, especially maps like this, which is a spectacularly large map. It's like 4 by 6 feet in size. It would hang on a wall. For those of you who don't, and many of these passages contain enough information, more often associated with books or atlases rather than a same map. That is, there's a lot of things on this map. The writing will often at least gesture at a bigger picture, a story, if you will, beyond the actual paper of the map that people in power at the time would understand. For those of you who don't study 18th century maps, that's no problem. I bet you can imagine that maps, especially those created prior to our time, often serve kind of a powerful government interest simply beyond knowing where something was. They wanted to claim territory. They did so by focusing on the achievements of their own people at the expense of someone else. They used borders, much of this being represented in the visual aspect of the map, symbols, borders, and so forth. So to recap in this overly long introduction, 2 things, the actual drawing on the map and the text on the map. So let's begin with one version of an imagined British Empire, perhaps the most famous version of the British Empire, conceived of by map makers in the middle of the 18th century. It's John Mitchell's 1755 map of the British and French dominions in North America. It's a famous map created by and for the British government at the moment that they are competing with the French for what they see as the future of empire in North America. This will be during the 7 years or French and Indian War. The map will be well respected by the British at the time and will be used for decades afterwards. After the British will lose their colonies in the Revolution, this map is famously used by negotiators during treaty talks, along with a map by Lewis Evans that you'll see later in the presentation. So I realize you can't read all the details on your screen, but you can surely see the ambitious color scheme that claims most of North America for Britain. There are many copies, different editions of this map in existence. The Bell Library actually has one from 1774 that you can easily find on the map portal. But I'm going with the Library of Congress collection because this particular edition from 1755 features the bold color scheme for the borders that you can see on Zoom and will serve the purposes of what I want to talk about. And so what you can see on the screen, I think, seems to be the ultimate in British imperial fantasy. What this map clearly argues is that the British controlled everything. What it actually means, I want to suggest, is actually the opposite, hidden in plain sight, that they controlled almost nothing beyond their coastal settlements. I want to suggest that the map's most important, perhaps credible claims to power actually came from a model of empire and, to some extent, a map developed by the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois of what is now upstate New York. How and why this could happen is hopefully interesting enough, a mystery of sorts that I want to unlock for you today. So all this talk of fantasy and imagination, to be sure, there is a real empire. From 1607 onward, the English had real colonies occupied by real colonists on the mainland of North America. And by that definition, England, or from 1707 onward, Great Britain, always had a North American empire, which had been planned poorly at first by people in power in England. Yet, from the earliest years, these colonies imagined themselves as something more than little struggling outposts along the rivers of the Atlantic coast. And the pretensions revealed a mix of profound geographic ignorance and imperial fictions that would have long-lasting consequences. And so you're looking at a map of Jamestown here from John Smith. And although Jamestown started off as a disaster, 80% of the first 10,000 colonists are dead within 15 years. The English charter for Virginia, as it's known, imagined extraordinary borders beyond the struggling colony. Borders stretching all the way to, quote unquote, the island of California, a claim that you can already sort of imagine on that fictitious borders that you saw on the Mitchell map to start with. So for those of you who have been there, or if you've looked at a real map of the United States, or if you're aware that we live on the planet Earth, you know that California is not an island. Moreover, I can also reassure you that the popular myth of a massive earthquake somehow creating one someday is actually an urban legend. But this island of California has a long history in colonial cartography. You can see it here on a map from 1701, complete with a nice bay, perhaps the future Arizona Bay once California breaks off from the ocean or breaks off into the ocean. But the point is that quite simply, beyond the Atlantic coast, the very early English politicians and leaders had no idea of what they were claiming. Yes, they knew there was a continent, but they, beyond their coastal enclaves, they had no idea what that continent entailed, which rendered such sweeping claims seemingly comically meaningless. That is, so what? You claim that you can stretch all the way to the island of California. It seems like a bad joke, only it's not quite meaningless. And it's not quite meaningless because of the history of how Europeans understand what becomes known as discovery. When Europeans began establishing overseas colonies, all of them, to some extent, justified their claim on a so-called doctrine of discovery. Now, if there are any students listening, congratulations. I would love to hear how you ended up being talked into attending this. But if there are any students listening, you may be tired of hearing the obvious point that Christopher Columbus didn't, quote unquote, discover anything, a point that will be made, I'm sure, on Indigenous Peoples Day / Columbus Day, which is very soon. But it's important to emphasize the meaning of that word, or at least the meaning of that concept to Europeans at the time, and indeed for centuries after 1492. What becomes known as a doctrine of discovery actually evolves out of the European experience in the Crusades from the 11th through the 13th centuries. So this is when the papacy emphasized the idea of just wars, quote unquote, just wars, to recover the Holy Lands from so-called infidels. And so the European understanding of the world and other people and what rights they should have in relation to other people is greatly shaped by their experience in these crusades. And so by the time Europeans crossed the Atlantic during the 15th and 16th centuries, discovery essentially meant that European powers claimed the right to exert sovereignty, to extend their kingdoms, if you will, over non-Christians who they believed failed to meet their understanding of what would eventually be called civilization. So discovery, the concept of discovery, entailed finding such land first relative to other Europeans who all understood that it was already inhabited. This is actually part of discovery. The discovery is, at least with this sort of crusade mentality, is meaningless if the land is empty. So they all knew that the land would already have people on it. That was sort of the point of discovery. And of course, America turns out to have an extraordinarily diverse number of peoples on it, who have all different kinds of land and claims of land. And so who's going to find those places, and what exactly claims will they have relative to other European powers becomes a matter of some dispute. This kind of ideal of discovery is at best a sort of textbook definition. In reality, discovery was at best an evolving concept. And in many cases, as the 7 Years' War would demonstrate, only actual warfare would make claims permanent, at least for European nations, not necessarily in relation to indigenous peoples. So at first, the English go along with the idea that looking at some land is discovering it. I'm being a little overly crude in general, but the idea that you look at some land and you've discovered it, that's kind of good enough. And you can see traces of this sort of thought pattern on some maps, not the ones I'm going to show you, but you can find them. There's one by a prolific map maker named Thomas Jeffries, who's really good at copying maps. In fact, he copies maps from the French a lot, but nevertheless, in 1755, has on one of his maps that Britain claimed, quote, claimed all North America to settle in by the discovery of Cabot in 1497. So you could see evidence of that kind of claim of discovery, but already by the time, the British usually emphasized actually settling the land as a measure of how an empire could claim something. That is, in the sort of broad process of creating an empire, you're supposed to discover some indigenous population who would then in turn sign over their land, and then you would settle it, and then that was your empire. There are problems with either approach, looking to claim land by discovery or looking to claim land by saying you had settled it. Either one of these approaches will be trouble for the British. Why? Well, by the 18th century, what exactly had the British discovered in North America? What had they actually occupied? Not much, it turned out. Confined to areas east of the Appalachian Mountains, much of, perhaps most, perhaps you could say almost all of their knowledge of North America's interior have been copied from French sources, who did all of the quote unquote discovering by traveling alongside Native American guides or explorers, if you will. That would be an interesting way to think of Native American travelers at this time. And so you can get a good sense of this reliance on other people's discoveries and other people's knowledge from two maps I'm going to show you. So here's one. Many of you are sitting in Hennepin County, so I wanted to show this. Louis Hennepin's map from 1698. It's kind of a weird case because Hennepin himself is kind of a strange character involved in all these conflicts with religious orders in France and then flees to England. So literally goes to England. And in most cases, this will not happen. The British are a little more subtle about how they would rely on French derived information. But here's one map from Hennepin, and here's another map from Edward Wells a couple years later. So to my mind, especially the waterways of the Great Lakes in the upper Midwest, where many of you are sitting, are entirely lifted, copied. Now, most of the, as I said, most of the copies are not so overt that we can kind of look at it this way, but historians of cartography who get into great detail on tracing the sort of intellectual origins of maps note that well into the 1700s, the British are relying pretty heavily on stealing from the French. So as we approach the middle of the 18th century, the British get a little bit better at making their own maps, still derived from French sources, but the British are pretty good at representing the geography of North America. And perhaps the first great, actually this is the first great map created by the British, is Henry Popple's map, created in 1733. So Popple's map is notable for many things. One is its sheer size. It's a really impressive sort of representation of North America. It's also noted in history for getting some basic geography wrong. John Adams will make fun of it a little bit and say that the not very accurate, some of the Great Lakes don't quite look right. And so all of this is true. But one of the most striking features, I think, of the map, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit, is the representation of Native American nations and settlements. Indian towns, not English settlements. If anything, Popple's map suggests just how big North America is and just how significant Indian country remained dominant to North America. But what it seemed to lack was a coherent, forceful story about how all these native peoples would somehow fit into a British Empire that had long imagined its borders pushing far ahead of its actual settlements. So this is a problem for the British, who have these pretensions, these ideas of grandeur born of disaster at Jamestown, that somehow the continent is supposed to be theirs, and they can even map it now and pretend that they did it themselves. But those maps, because they're relatively accurate, reveal a geographic truth that this looks an awful lot like native North America and not British North America. So as we approach the 1750s, the British find themselves in need of a good story that they could sell about how somehow during this time of competition between the British and the French, which is reaching its bloody conclusion in the 7 Years' War, really the First World War, by far the most important colonial war prior to the Revolution. What sort of story can they sell that they have some kind of plausible claim to anything beyond what they quote unquote discovered some places only 70 miles inland from the coast? So we're back where we started, the most famous map of the period, John Mitchell's map of the British and French dominions in North America, and our mystery of how any of this could possibly make any sense. And it's very striking, I think, just by the color scheme. We've only moved 2 decades ahead. The boldness of Mitchell's map relative to Popple. But what is, and I know you can't see it entirely, but I'll show you some detail in a moment. What is also still a feature of this map, the continuity, is the number of Native American towns on it, which have actually increased from Popple's map, I believe. And so how can he make sense of this world? What sort of rationale is Mitchell developing that is even remotely believable? So this map is published after the 7 Years' War had already begun. And in some ways, like colonial maps like Mitchell's would seem to be a clear invention of the British. You can even see Native Americans represented as seemingly begging for the British Empire in the corner, the map's cartouche. And there's a long history of these in other maps as well, of sort of portraying Native people as living in a state of nature, just begging for civilization, begging for discovery, if you will. And it's clear on Mitchell's map that you got a little bit of this imagery going on that is suggesting, along with those borders, the kind of mastery of the British Empire in North America, how powerful they are. But a closer reading of his map reveals sort of the opposite conclusion, and the ideas of another important group with their own ideas about conquest and territory. This group is the Iroquois Six Nations, who call themselves the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. So the key to unlocking the seemingly mad claims of Mitchell's map is here, in the pinkish shaded territory near the Great Lakes, where he identified Native people, apparently, we zoom in, conquered and expelled by the Iroquois, yet somehow grouped under British North America. So here's our gateway to an interesting story, seemingly of conquest, but by whom? So the origins of a seemingly plausible British claims to strategically important parts of North America interior began not here in 1755, but with the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, some 100 years earlier. So the Haudenosaunee are a culturally related group of Native Americans who speak related Iroquoian languages. In the 17th century, there were 5 Iroquois nations inhabiting lands that are now upstate New York: the Mohawk, the Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. Sometime prior to their contact with Europeans, at least by the year 1500, if not earlier, the 5 nations had formed a league, a league of peace to resolve a time of conflict. which was sustained by village leaders regularly meeting at a council fire hosted at the town of Onondaga. So at peace within the League, the Haudenosaunee directed their aggression outward, especially towards other Iroquoian speakers who remained outside of this League of Peace. These people included the Erie, the Wenro, Neutral, most famously the Huron Confederacy across the Great Lakes in what is now Canada. So the Iroquois Haudenosaunee also had long-standing conflicts with other people, Algonquin-speaking peoples throughout the Great Lake region, including the Mississauga, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and others. So the so-called Beaver Wars, or the Iroquois Wars of the 17th century, are very well known to early American historians. And these conflicts sometimes even make their way into introductory level college classrooms and even K-12. So the brief version that you need to know for what I'm trying to tell you tonight for understanding maps in the British Empire is this. So for much of the 17th century, the Haudenosaunee became caught up in a cycle of violence and death that directly resulted from the European presence in the Americas, from colonialism. Specifically, European diseases, European weapons, but also to some extent European trade. But these conflicts are largely going to be fought by Native Americans. By 1640, the Haudenosaunee had acquired enough firearms from the Dutch, who had trading posts in the Hudson River Valley, to briefly have technological superiority over their enemies. At the same time, they become somewhat dependent on European trade goods, and they want access to beaver hunting land so they can trade more. There's a cycle of depleting resources and then having to push farther to get access to hunting land into Canada. But perhaps most importantly, and more importantly than simply trade, is that the Haudenosaunee had suffered devastating losses from epidemics spreading across North America. In Iroquoian societies, as in other Native American cultures, you could replace a deceased individual with the captive taken in war. And so began a series of seemingly never-ending and increasingly violent conflicts, sometimes called the Mourning Wars. One after one, the Haudenosaunee attacked, dispersed, and absorbed captives from their neighbors. The Erie, Neutral, and Huron all fell victim during the 1640s and 1650s. After the fall of the Huron, the Haudenosaunee turned their attention and conflict towards Algonquin-speaking people of the Great Lakes. So at first, these conflicts played out in a similar fashion to earlier victories. The Haudenosaunee Five Nations pushed people west to resettle lands all the way towards what is now Wisconsin. But by the 1690s, the tide had turned against the Haudenosaunee. The Mississauga, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and others, including their French allies, had turned the tide of the war, at least to the extent that the Haudenosaunee only truly controlled land in what is now New York State. That is, the Haudenosaunee got pushed back to Iroquoia proper, Iroquoia being their homelands in central and western New York. And so the English, as the English are looking for ways to plausibly claim an empire beyond their discovered coast on lands mapped only by copying French cartographers, a group of Haudenosaunee leaders strolled into Albany in 1701 with something of an answer. These men are looking for friends during a harsh time, and they had an idea of how to encourage such friendship. At Albany, an English city that had replaced Dutch trading posts along the Hudson River, the Haudenosaunee offered a considerable amount of land to the English government with the intent that the crown would then be obligated to be a, quote, protector and defender to the Haudenosaunee from any future French aggression. Now, what's really significant about this deed in 1701 is that the Haudenosaunee would retain perpetual access to the land in question. That is, it was not a sale. It was a transference of land to share, but to have protected by the English crown. The deed drawn up refers to an area of 400 miles north to south, 800 miles in width. There are specific geographic features mentioned, but in general, the lands were, quote, all the land where the beaver hunting is, which we won with the sword 80 years ago. That is, those 17th century conflicts I just told you about. Significantly, the parties at Albany produced a map that depicted this land. Now, through the miracle of technology in the history profession, also known as PowerPoint, I can render this somewhat more visible to you at home. And so only a few scholars have written on this map. It was actually lost, or at least not known about for some time until really the 1990s. In the 21st century, people have paid more attention to this map. And I agree with those. And it would be great if I was the one who found it. That would be a great story, but I was not. I agree with those who did find it and see much indigenous input in this map, especially because the lakes don't appear anything like the published maps of the period. And for my own work, I know that's it would be very common for a Haudenosaunee traveler to draw maps for Europeans. We know this from all kinds of accounts of travelers into the Haudenosaunee homelands, because even within land near their colonies, if the English or anybody wanted to travel into native ground, they almost inevitably needed native guides. And so into the 18th century, travelers to Iroquoia, the Haudenosaunee's homelands, relied on Iroquois guides. And so Moravian missionaries have left journals that you can read that are very interesting from the 1740s and the 1750s. And they reported that their guides drew waterways, basic outlines of how they were connected. And waterways are especially important to travel in times before modern industrial transportation networks. Everybody traveled by water and then trails that connected those waterways. And from everything we know, the Haudenosaunee would have clearly had geographic knowledge of the Great Lakes, and even the Mississippi River, which does come up sometimes in conversation. So thus, it would seem very plausible, indeed probable, that the Haudenosaunee leaders, the headmen at Albany in 1701, at least helped draw this map to explain the territory that they intended to place under English quote unquote protection. And so what I'm kind of getting at, and I hope I'm not overselling it, but I think it's worth considering anyhow, is that in effect, they created the first map of what became known in history as the Iroquois Empire, this sort of far-reaching conquered lands, allegedly conquered by the Haudenosaunee, and therefore under their control and influence. And this is a good story, and it's one that would be retold and developed by the Five Nations and English colonial officials over the course of the 18th century, at least until the Revolution, but it still has some hold on the American imagination afterwards. And so as imagined, this incredibly powerful native empire would, in effect, be an empire within an empire, a conqueror of Native American nations who in turn was either dependent or allied on the British, depending upon who's talking about this. Put another way, the Haudenosaunee saw themselves as more equals with the British, and then of course the English would emphasize them as being more dependent. In reality, they're somewhat dependent on each other. So put another way, they drew what became, and here's where I'm hopefully not taking too far of a leap, the British Empire in North America. An empire not built by British discovery or British conquest or British settlements, none of which had any real claim, but Native American allies of the British. So, but this empire, both of the empires, the British and the Iroquois Empire, had some complications. And the complications start right away. At virtually the same time that the Haudenosaunee are busy signing over their quote unquote hunting land for protection in Albany, a different delegation had been busy in Montreal. In these negotiations at Montreal, the Haudenosaunee agreed to peace with New France and with the Indian nations of the Great Lakes. In exchange, they gained access to French trading posts, and significantly, they agreed to share the hunting lands north of Lake Ontario and Lake Erie with Western Indians. Of course, as I just told you, they essentially simultaneously were telling the English that these were their lands to protect from aggressive French incursions. So that's complicated. And of course, on the international stage, there's more complications. The French never gave up their claims to this land, which they saw as part of New France. Neither did the Mississauga or other native people. And the English knew, to add to the complications, that the only way they would permanently ever get the French out of there was through the help of the Five Nations, who then just happened to emerge as the essential diplomatic military players of the Northeast through a combination of skillful diplomacy and geographic position as being between these rival empires. And so in effect, the Haudenosaunee began playing both sides, which set the precedent for what became known as this famous period of Iroquois neutrality. To avoid the bloodshed of the 17th century, the Haudenosaunee spent much of the 18th century leveraging their position between the French and the British to gain diplomatic favor, and of course, whenever possible, gifts. And so there are all kinds of conferences, treaties, but they're not just all to sign over land or anything like that. They're to renew or at least threaten these alliances. That is, the Haudenosaunee could threaten to shift the balance of power from the French to the British and so forth. And they put themselves in a good position to do so from the first decades of the 1700s. The Five Nations, especially the Mohawk, gradually grew closer to the British colonies, especially New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. In these colonies, they came to leverage their position of power to claim to speak for other native nations, and in turn would gain more favor from the English colonial officials. But the Haudenosaunee always insisted upon their own sovereignty or ability to control their political destiny. And so as a British official sort of famously wrote, this is an often quoted passage in 1754, to preserve the balance between us and the French is the great ruling principle of the modern Indian politics. And so the Haudenosaunee succeeded in carving out one of the longer lasting regions of power, a shape of power, as some people have called it, in colonial society, resisting massive land losses until after the American Revolution. And their story is pretty remarkable. If you think of how long from European contact in the 1630s onward, they're able to maintain much of their homeland and indeed occupy a relatively powerful position in these homelands. So this raises some interesting questions. Was there really an Iroquois Empire? Well, not really. But what I'd like to emphasize is that at least in terms of geography, in terms of territory, square miles, if you will, every quote unquote traditional European style empire in North America, the English, the French, the Spanish, even the Russians get in the game. All of these empires contain quite a bit of fiction. In terms of area, almost all empires were real only on paper. So along those lines, this Iroquois Empire is just as real as an imagined French empire that somehow claimed much of North America's interior, despite having almost nobody living there. So if we return back to Mitchell's map, I think you can see the imprint of the Haudenosaunee all over it. That is, they are an extraordinary key to unlocking his claims for North America. And so we can look at a few places. If we go to what is now essentially Illinois, his British Empire's boundaries clearly follow the 1901 map, insofar as you can, it's pretty rough estimates in terms of this kind of mapping, and at least the deed or agreement. In effect, the story he tells of conquest is actually one that he doesn't come up with himself, but is developed and sold by the Haudenosaunee, who find eager listeners in British colonial officials. And so there's a ton of writing all over this map. And after the lecture, if you are interested, it's pretty easy to find. The Library of Congress one is pretty high resolution. That's the one. But the Bell Library also has one that you can zoom in on and read all of these different passages. This one is, sorry to make you tilt your head, not too far to the south of what you were just looking at. And what it is explaining here is that more stories of Haudenosaunee conquest and how they've created a chain of dependency with other nations who they have subdued, and therefore they've conquered this land and it's part of, through this agreement, the British Empire. So to be sure, all of this is greatly exaggerated, but it is rooted in a hazy memory of those 17th century conflicts. That is, treat these passages with more than a grain of salt in terms of how much conquest actually happened and how much power anybody has over these people. But it is rooted in those memories of this formidable wars of the 1600s. So you can find evidence of the 1701 deed and map all over Mitchell's map here, but he also seems to be running farther than that. If we follow other stories he's telling, he's imagined British Iroquois Empire clearly goes farther. A quick glance into Canada illustrates this reach, where the dashed line along the Ottawa River notes the, quote, bounds of the Six Nations, which somehow put the Haudenosaunee on the doorstep of Montreal itself, a city which not even Mitchell, with this awesome color scheme, could find a way to claim. So he has to stop there. But these newly claimed lands, this is beyond what was drawn on that 1701 map or deed. These seem to be him running beyond what the Haudenosaunee would have told him. Their lands occupied by the Mississauga, who had actively pushed the Haudenosaunee out of Canada in the 1690s. So here, Mitchell seems to be inventing some conquest or something that never happened. Seems to take this idea of this Iroquois Empire and run with it. But it's not quite his invention either. Ever eager to play up their numbers and importance to the British, the Haudenosaunee had been regularly feeding them stories about the extent of their alliances and their influence. In a conference at Albany in 1746, Haudenosaunee representatives informed the governor that, quote, we, the Six Nations, are now assembled together as one, and we take in the Mississauga for the seventh nation, and what is to be spoken by one mouth are the joint and sincere thoughts of every heart. And again, in 1751, New York's colonial governor, George Clinton, wrote to the Board of Trade with some good news from the Haudenosaunee, who reported that, quote, very lately, 9 castles, or more properly villages, on the east side of Lake Erie have strictly united with them and submitted themselves to the King of Great Britain. These, I think, are the Mississauga, who joined us in the late war, that is King George's War, for those of you keeping track, and have removed from their former habitations to avoid the resentment of the French. So this information was sent to the Board of Trade, which is this great bureaucracy managing the colonies, but also the sponsor of Mitchell's map. So again, the imagination of the most imperial of the imperial cartographers was actually relying on ideas dreamed up by Native Americans, the only ones who could possibly, if not entirely plausibly, claim lands that the British coveted. So intellectually, this is all fascinating, at least I think so, but does it matter to history? Well, yes, most definitely. As some of you probably know, the 7 Years' War, the war to define the future of North America between the French and the British, began in fortifications built near present-day Pittsburgh, land allegedly part of Haudenosaunee Iroquois Empire control, and therefore okay for the British. And it's at that point that the sort of imagination of where these empires could go met reality, because the French had insisted that that was part of their domains. And in fact, many of the native people who lived in the region didn't necessarily think of the Iroquois Six Nations as speaking for them. And so it's the 7 Years' War that will resolve some of these imagined empires, at least as it relates to the British and the French claims. So at that point, fantasy and reality are only resolved by worldwide conflict that replaced imagined conquest with a real one that ended the French Empire in North America. But I also think this research, at least thinking along these lines, is important for how we teach early American history, which is something I do, and I imagine some of you do, or you've taken a class in early American history. So variations on this sort of Haudenosaunee model of empire, or at least the importance of Native American settlements, are all over Mitchell's imagined, how he imagines the rest of British North America. That is, almost everywhere the British Empire on that map is built using Native American people in their villages, which means that Mitchell finds a way. First, he has to acknowledge that they have power and claim over some land, then implies that the crown, the British crown, is the only one who really has the authority to recognize those claims, and then finds a way to spin almost every native group in the East to be in some kind of ally of England. That is beyond the obvious boundaries of what the Iroquois Empire conquered. Mitchell first recognized some native power, found a story to tell about how they were allied with the English, usually through trade, sometimes through formal diplomacy. And so much of the map's British Empire results not from British towns or British conquest, but from the fact that allegedly British allied Native Americans lived there. Now, all this is not to say that the British greatly appreciated Indians or that Mitchell or other cartographers weren't entirely self-serving. It's very clear from his map that they are. They're trying to gain every advantage that they can at the expense of the French and, of course, Native Americans who still planned on managing their own affairs rather than being part of some imagined empire. Yet, I think what I want to sort of conclude with when thinking about these maps and how they make these bold claims, I think if we emphasize that aspect of the map, the seemingly mastery of the map maker to represent reality, we can fixate a little too much on that impulse and that apparent ability to make those claims rather than on what such boldness was actually trying to hide. That is, Mitchell's map, and I've got Evan's map up here because I want to talk about Onondaga in a second, but Mitchell's map is, if nothing, it's bold. And that boldness is classic overconfidence. And that overconfidence is trying to hide something. And that's something that it's hiding is an obvious fact from the maps that develop over the 18th century, that most of North America is still actually native ground. It's native North America. And the British, the French, and the Spanish all understood that power across those lands rested in Native American villages. There are over 200 Native American villages on Mitchell's map. All of Mitchell's exaggerations, even lies about how friendly natives were to the British, rested on the fact that he needed to account for their power. That's the real story of his map. It's all over it. But take a look at a textbook today, is Onondaga there. The village, which Mitchell understood to be the center of Haudenosaunee power, is featured very clearly on Lewis Evans' map. Evans actually traveled there with Haudenosaunee guides. It's probably not there, but it's a recognized center of power in the 18th century world of these maps. Put another way, I think we risk overlooking the centrality of Native American places, their territory, their settlements, their paths to both empire and the Atlantic world. And if we really want to capture history as it was, rather than how it became, which is apparently the central goal of historians, it's important to acknowledge this reality. So that's all I have for you tonight. I hope that I've at least suggested ways of putting maps into conversation with exciting scholarship that has been written about Native American history. And I want to thank you all for coming to my talk. I very much appreciate it. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Chad. That was lovely. We do have some questions coming in, and I will start with the first one. Do any of the British or the French at this time have a grasp of the way Native peoples considered land holdings?
Yes, they do. And so that's a great question. I will answer it, I promise. I just want to talk about sort of thinking about land holdings in general and sort of how we confuse sort of different understandings of claims on the land. That is, famously, Native Americans don't have an emphasis on private property in the exact same way that Europeans do, in that you can commodify a parcel of land and then sell that land and it permanently transfers. And that kind of property understanding is obviously a point of much contention during the colonial period. But what they do have, and what Europeans clearly understand, is ideas about sovereignty over the land, that they control specific territory, and that they have, and that those territories are anchored in the use of specific settlements and specific peoples, and that you have sovereignty being a sort of concept that overlaps between Europeans and Native people. And Europeans know full well that Native nations are very protective of their territory, and that they understand that that is their territory. And the map makers and people talking about maps in general sometimes even reference this. And in some of my other work, I've talked about language that is used to describe settling Indians that a few commentators associated with map making in the middle of the 1700s used. That is, they understood that all the Native people east of the Mississippi had settlements, and that they were very jealous, as the word that was used, of the territory associated with those settlements and their hunting ground. And so that is something that they are aware of, I believe. I hope I answered it.
I'll feed you the next set of questions.
All right.
There are a couple here about the Iroquois map that you showed from the British
Sure.
Library, I think you said. So where is it? Who found it? And let's see, and then there's another question here. The notion, Native people's notion of geography and cartography, in other words, in what sort of context would that map have been drawn?
Okay. The exact name of the person who found it escapes me, but you can, it's still in England. There are copies. There is a copy that was made that I believe is in the university. I think Pitt has it. There's a later edition from the 1880s that I think is in a rare collection at the University of Pittsburgh. But if you Google, I hate to tell you to Google things, but if you Google, William Starna wrote an article, Google William Starna 1701 map, and it will have the sort of history of how this map was uncovered. And so it'll give you a little bit more of a sense of when it was found and how it's been used. So that was the hard question. The easy question is, how does this relate to Native understandings of map making? And I think the sort of most obvious answer to that is an emphasis on waterways. And I believe you can get, if you find the sort of copy that exists of this map, which was made at some point before the map faded to this state, you can get a better sense of some other waterways. But the Great Lakes are apparent on this map. And I think people who have studied Native American cartography note that there is a sort of emphasis on water. And, you can note geographic features, different parts of rapids and so forth, and that this is important parts of how they travel throughout Native North America. There are some British maps of the period that do a pretty good job of at least suggesting trail networks. And so trail networks also exist and are really important parts of travel. But they're a little bit harder to map with certainty than rivers, because trails shift and trail conditions are kind of notoriously variable. But you can actually find some maps that display Native American trails as well. And so there's a decent sense of, linking places, especially by water. I think that's a prominent feature of this map. The Great Lakes, Superior is not on here. I know it's kind of hard to tell which of those lakes. You basically have Michigan, Huron, and then Erie and Ontario.
Our next question asks if you could talk a bit more about how the Ojibwe were affected by these events and alliances. Louise Erdich has written about the Ojibwe migration westward. Was that migration story part of the Iroquois story?
Yeah, so they're caught up in the conflicts. I don't have a great answer for you. They're caught up in the conflicts of the 1600s. But I think most of the people who study Ojibwe history emphasize that they do a lot better against the Haudenosaunee than the English will imagine later on. So they do pretty well and do not suffer a conquest or the same sort of level of trauma experienced by the people immediately across the Great Lakes, like the Huron and so forth. So I don't have a great answer for that.
Thank you.
Let me see. Let me pick another one here. How did the Dutch maps of this time handle these issues?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't have an answer to that either. The Dutch don't. So I'm not really exceedingly familiar with Dutch cartography. As many of you know, the Dutch don't do so well in New Netherland after the 1660s because the English thought New York would be a better name for it. And so I don't know, but I would imagine that they don't speak to the interior to a very great extent. I mean, the Dutch sort of presence in North America is during a time still of pretty strong geographic ignorance beyond the coastal regions. Like, so the English start being able to kind of map some stuff in the Appalachian, sort of trans-Appalachian Southeast in the 1670s. They kind of have some better sense of that, but it's still like not very good cartography at that point. And so the Dutch aren't really known, so far as I know, for pushing very far inland and representing it on maps. But I would be happy if somebody were to correct me and show me some cool Dutch maps.
I think we can arrange that.
I know.
A couple of thank yous for an interesting talk and the shift of perspective. And here are two questions that to me seem to sort of follow one on the other. And the first part is, are there Native voice sources that inform your thesis? And do you think these maps might be entered in as evidence for reconciliation for Native Americans?
Oh, somebody asked the really loaded question. So the answer to the second one is yes, and it gets really complicated to an extent that I'll get there. The first one, as far as Native voices, Native voices are pretty well represented in colonial documentary history in terms of all these negotiations that happen, treaty conferences, which are not treaties in the sense that we understand them today. Like if you have a treaty today, it's a document, and then it's so you sort of have a piece of paper that somebody agreed with. You do have documents in the colonial period, but most of the treaties are actually these days-long events, and there's speeches given, and the treaties are almost all done on Native terms, which is a very interesting fact of colonial history, that the English will have to deal with, especially the Haudenosaunee, but others, on Native terms. So they do Native ceremonies. They have to like repeat things. They have to come back later and then repeat things again. And it takes a long time. And so there's like really detailed documents explaining what people were saying to each other. Now, it gets a little complicated if we're talking about Native voices, because you're dealing with translated words. And so we have people who are translators who sometimes, like Conrad Weiser is a German guy who is translated into English from Iroquois speakers. And, you have questions about translation, questions about representation, but actually the documentary record is pretty extensive. It's actually the best documentary evidence we have for Native voices is stuff related to diplomacy. And so the English have extensive records of talking with the Haudenosaunee at these conferences from 1701 all the way through the Revolution. You can find them in the papers of William Johnson, who becomes the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern Colonies, but you can find them pretty accessible online as well. I'm looking over here. The Lancaster Treaty of 1744 has a nice little reader that you can, shouldn't be plugging other books, but you could find these documents pretty easily accessible to read and see what Native people had to say about territory and treaties. And a lot of the events mentioned on Mitchell's map have corresponding records. So there's a record of 1701, and he talks about some other dates, 1725. When we get to the, I don't have a zoom in on the Ohio country, but there's a lot of details about what the Haudenosaunee think of the Ohio country and so forth. And so you can read those and kind of see how this is following that or not, to what extent they're just kind of making stuff up or not. And you can, I could tell you on Mitchell's map here, he lies about a place that is not zoom inable at this moment, but there's a place called Logstown, which hosts a treaty, and there's all kinds of records related to what's going on there. And it hosts a negotiation between the Virginia Company and an alleged representative of the Six Nations to build these forts that will start the 7 Years' War. And Mitchell will lie about that place on this map, and he says it's an English town, but it's really a Shawnee, Delaware, Haudenosaunee, like all kinds of people living there town. And so you can read about what they said happened there, and then you can see what Mitchell claims it is. And he's just like, oh, it's a English town. So there's quite a few lies on this map, in addition to its exaggerations. Now, the big question about reconciliation and rights. So I don't really want to go into recorded detail on the consequences of this for First Nations people in Canada, because it is actually a contentious issue right now, in that this is also sometimes called the Nanfan Treaty, which is the agreement that they make with the English official's name at Albany in 1701, and it's part of law in Canada. And so this is important for Six Nations rights in Canada today, because it is part of their claims to the land. After the American Revolution, the Six Nations are divided in the Revolution, and some of them go to Canada and they resettle there. But their rights in Canada are also guaranteed by this deed and this map. However, it presents some complications because, as you might have guessed from my discussion of this empire that is created, there are other Native First Nations people in Canada who don't see this as a valid treaty because they don't think that they were conquered, and that there was no right to sell this land or put it in any kind of deed, and so therefore it is not valid. And the Mississauga have ongoing, I believe, claims related to controversies over this. Good questions.
Let me see. Do you know, I think there's at least one question on this. Are there any articles, books, or podcasts you'd recommend about this topic that was written by Indigenous authors?
Oh, about maps or about Indigenous empires in general?
That's complicated, isn't it? One of another person in the audience recommended, where is it? Ojibwe Wasa Ina Bida by Thomas Peacock of the Fond du Lac Ojibwe Band, which is about Ojibwe migration history.
Cool. Yeah, go on. Were there any more recommendations that can save me before I look on the bookshelf?
I was going to say, because that's probably a rather broad, yeah.
So there's a couple books, An Infinity of Nations, infinity like the number, An Infinity of Nations is a good book about, an excellent book about the Great Lakes region. More, outside west of the Haudenosaunee. For the Haudenosaunee themselves, the clay we are made of is about Grand River, and it's also a history of the Haudenosaunee in general, but it goes all the way to 1924, and so that is also something that you could look at. As far as maps and cartography, off the top of my head, not as many suggestions.
Do you know, it seems to me, I can only remember the title of the book, not the person who wrote it, but I think that this person also writes on maps. Our Beloved Kin.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Lisa Brooks.
Yeah. Lisa Brooks. That's it.
Lisa Brooks. And so, see, I'm stuck in the Great Lakes. And so if you, Lisa Brooks writes about the Northeast, and it's, she does work with sort of maps, but also kind of recapturing place names and indigenous spaces and stories associated with those spaces. And so King Philip's War is a really traumatic war, 1676, and it's sort of foundational in early American history. There's been a lot written about it, but she has a new, really well-received book, or at least newish for history, well-received book that deals with space, if not cartography, but at least in space and places.
We have a question that came in, and someone who wants to know what you think of the idea of settler colonialism, particularly in the context of how these maps may have been miscommunicated in textbooks. And if you could also, for those people in the audience who don't know what that is, if you could explain what settler colonialism is as well, that would be awesome.
So settler colonialism is sort of a reaction against American exceptionalism. And now I'm talking like a historian, which means that it made no sense at all. So settler colonialism is an international sort of approach to thinking about how Europeans have created settler states in different parts of the globe and replaced the indigenous people with their own colonists, settler colonials, who then become the sort of natives in a place that used to have natives. They become neo-natives, if you will, or they imagine themselves as the sort of true occupants of a land. And so it's in US history, it's kind of a reaction against the idea of the US being exceptional, because the US traditional stories of the United States sort of grounded in like struggle over freedom and a rise, however long, of a struggle of civil rights and so forth. But if you put the US in conversation with other settler states around the globe, you can start seeing patterns. There's interesting work comparing like the US to Australia and how indigenous people are treated in those places. And so settler colonialism is an important concept for understanding American history, because at some point the US truly becomes a sort of settler colonial place where indigenous people are confined, or at least supposed to be put on reservations, and are sort of written out of history, and are not granted the place that you would imagine they could have in their original homelands. What's a little bit complicated about it, and so I don't want to say there's a generational divide in early American history, but there is some sort of wariness in early American history about applying the concept of settler colonialism a little too broadly, because it can have the sort of unintended consequence of erasing Native people and sort of making it all seem inevitable. Like you can look at a settler colonial textbook and it looks an awful lot like what US textbooks used to be, where you start in the East and then the Europeans roll to the West. And in each point, you have like indigenous people who are conquered, and then you move on to the next place, and it happens again and again. And to be sure, obviously, much of that is true. But the complexity of early America is that it takes a very long time for that to happen, and that Native people are actually very powerful for a very long time. And so balancing that sort of tension is what's difficult when using settler colonialism and thinking about how it relates to all of the scholarship on Native American history that came out sort of before settler colonialism became a trendy topic, because at least since probably Richard White's Middle Ground in 1991, there's been a sort of realization and then like foregrounding of the power of Native people and how much of the continent is Native land. And you have all these different centers of power. We have great books on the Comanche Empire, Lakota America, both by Pekka Hemelainen recently, that emphasize, the agency, and that's the sort of key here, of Native people to shape not only their future, but the future of the continent. And that kind of agency can get a little bit lost if you focus a little too much on a settler colonial narrative of just like the march of the English westward and then their descendants, the Americans, because colonial Native American history right now is also very much about all these powerful places. And I think that's what you can see on Mitchell's map, that is trying to be a settler sort of colonial map of like, hey, here's our empire, but has 200 plus Native American villages on it. And so it's basically lying, and it's a pretty bad lie. And so I realize that's a long answer, but it's a relatively sort of complicated thing to try to just explain power in the colonial world, and how it's important to avoid the sense of inevitability. The French almost win the 7 Years' War for a while. And, Joseph Brant, the famous Mohawk leader, during the Revolution, tries to create a boundary between the settlers and Native Indian country, so he can sort of try to slow down the expansion, and he almost wins. I mean, the British almost won. Joseph Brant almost won. And it doesn't mean that the world would be a happy, different place, but it could have been a different place. And what that difference is, well, we don't know. But historians are also very uncomfortable with inevitability. And so that's what I'm trying to suggest, that it's important to avoid when thinking about settler colonialism and the colonial world.
Here, I'm going to read a question that gives you a chance to plug your book.
All right.
It says, your book, The Storied Landscape of Iroquoia, sounds fascinating. Do you have plans to publish a future text focusing on a different Indigenous tribe?
Well, so I'll plug my book. And so do I have plans on a different Indigenous tribe? Or nation, I should say, really. Not immediately, no. I'm interested in early American history, broadly speaking, and I don't necessarily consider myself purely an ethno-historian or purely a historian of Native North America. And I think if you are somehow get a copy of my book, you'll see what I try to do in the Storied Landscape of Iroquoia is suggest the significance of a place, a region, Iroquoia, to not only Native people, but to the future of the United States and American culture. The book starts roughly in the period that we've been looking at during lecture, 1750, and goes through the emergence of a new religion, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, in the homelands of the Haudenosaunee. And so it's a book about interesting places that you might find there, and that stories that people might tell about the land in a sort of contested time of appropriation and reinvention, the settler colonial stuff during the early 19th century. That is, there's all kinds of fantastic stories that settlers start telling about what happened and what this land meant. You'll have to read the book to find out all those awesome stories. But there's also the Haudenosaunee who still live there and have their own tales of their own ancient history that they tell, and actually in one spectacular case publish. David Cusick is a Tuscarora historian who publishes the first book of Native American history, which I should have plugged when somebody asked about this. Comes out the 1820s. The exact date is not entirely clear. About 1826, David Cusick's History of the Six Nations, and it's not a super accessible book, but it's a history of his people and their land. And so my book is really kind of tries to bridge the worlds of the settlers and the Haudenosaunee to explore the connections over the long term.
We're going to wrap it up with a comment and one final question that I'm going to sort of combine together. The first comment is, as one of our viewers recommends David Troyer's book, narrating the apocalypse, 10,000 BCE to 1890, particularly part 1, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, which discusses the Great Lake Indians and the Anishinaabe tribes. Mentioning it's an excellent resource with lots of notes, and that he is an Indigenous writer and scholar. The questions that have come in, the last ones, are sort of 2 parts regarding Indigenous cartography. The first part is, you mentioned that the maps British maps often copied the French maps for place names, and therefore these are, sort of came from French sources. And if you could confirm whether or not that's where Mitchell got his place names, but also were these maps used to create the descriptions of lands in treaties, or the other way around? And then finally, do you know of other Indigenous maps that might be accessible that have survived? So tie all that up in a bow and we'll end the evening.
So yeah, David Troyer's book is back there. It's a very accessible book, and he has some notes. It moves very quickly, so check the notes for the colonial period, and then you can see what he read. He's also from Minnesota, so it's worth mentioning. His brother is a noted scholar of Ojibwe at Bemidji State, Anton. So the questions about the place names. I don't know how many place names Mitchell ripped off from French sources. I know that Popple's map gets accused of relying a little too heavily on them, and I imagine Mitchell has some of them as well. So that's not a great answer to that. In terms of other Indigenous maps, there's a famous map, and let's see if I have it. This is the sort of fun of being on the bookshelf, and no, I don't. I'll find it for you. There are very few Indigenous maps. Here we go. In colonial North America that survive. There's this famous map called the Deerskin Map, Catawba, CATAWBA, created in 1721. It's created with the help of an English official as well. And so I could hold it up to the camera, but that would be kind of awkward. But if you look at if you Google this at some time, it's a 1721 map. It's from South Carolina, and it's CATAWBA. It's a sort of relational map in that it's not a traditional looking map in the same sense that you're looking on here with sort of European geography. It's more, it shows relations between different villages, and it's often reprinted in textbooks because it's the best looking map that exists. And it's an interesting one to look at because it is one that doesn't rely as much on geographic features as it is sort of like just explaining relationships. And so I would look that one up. I know you can find it online. It has to be available pretty easily. And so that's the best one to look at. There's another one that I mentioned in an article that I wrote, and I believe it's by Chegere something. It's like Chegeree. It's a pretty rare map. The Library of Congress has it, but it's almost illegible. It's of the Ohio country, but there is a map that shows sort of strategic information about the Ohio country from the 1750s. If you manage to, I can find it for you. If you want to email me, I can find the correct link to it. It's in an article I wrote, which will probably be hard for people listening to find, but I'd be happy to send you that as well. But that's another one that does exist, and that is attributed to a native creator, and it survives. It's slightly less faded than the 1701 map that you saw. In terms of the maps or the treaties, which comes first? Usually the treaties, but not always. Like this map that has been serving as a good background is used for treaties after the fact because it's for making borders during the American Revolution. The British and the Americans will pull this out and kind of look at it. But for the most part, there are not a lot of maps created prior to a treaty that I know of. For the most part, at least not ones that survive. For the most part, they're created afterwards. What an anticlimactic note to end on, but.
Well, I want to thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. I'm sure people will have more questions after they think about it a little bit. The recording will be posted on the library's YouTube channel in a couple of weeks, and we'll have a link to it on the Bell Library's website. Again, thank you so much for the lecture. It was a pleasure, and we hope that you will be visiting us in person sometime in the near future.
Thank you again, everyone. It was great. I truly appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate the questions, everyone, as well.
Thank you, and thank you
so
all
much,
for coming. Good night.